Hi, James and Mitchell here, and in this video, I'm continuing my look at Kathy's Grand Tableau, this time focusing on the first three cards, so stay tuned. And here we are with Kathy's Grand Tableau laid out. And the cards that I'm using for this series come from the Lenormand. And as you may recall in our previous video where I talked about the initial impressions that I got from the Tableau, here I'm pointing out that we have Kathy here in the second row, and her card falls into the house of the child, and so this is a time she's in this space of a new beginning, you know, having to start again or start over, as the situation is that her husband, who is the gentleman, which is the card in front of her, approached Kathy one day out of the blue and just said that he was leaving, that he needed his space, and his card happens to fall into the house of the fox, and so one of the meanings of the fox for me is independence. So that was kind of his thing. He just said he needed some space, he needed to be away, and so he kind of just left her. And so now we're going to be picking things up with the situation, looking at the first three cards in the tableau, which is initially after I make my initial impressions, that's where I go to kind of get a more in-depth look at the cards. Is how I start. And so the first three cards in the tableau represent the general advice being given to Kathy about the situation. So we have the moon, we have the mountain, and we have the sun. So those are going to be the focus cards for this video. So I'm going to take a moment and readjust the cards so we can get a closer view of those cards. And here we are. I've readjusted the camera so we can get a close-up of the three cards. And again, the first three cards are going to be offering us general advice for Kathy's situation. And we have the moon, we have the mountain, and we have the sun. So the first card for me always represents what's triggering. I call it the trigger card. What's triggering the situation. Here in the house of the rider, the rider represents what's coming in, what's arriving, what's being initiated. So I tend to read it that way too as well. So moon here in the first position is a card of recognition. So it says here that something is being recognized or needs to be recognized. I'm tending to look at this more from the standpoint of emotional satisfaction. Typically, I see the moon card as a card of career and reputation and recognition along those lines, but it's important that we keep in context with the question. So this is really not a work-related question. It's more of an emotional type of situation because it involves a relationship, so love and romance kind of slant. And that was the intention for me doing this series, is that I was honoring the request, and so I'm going to go with the moon card, honoring, because something being honored, the request of people who wanted to see me read the cards with that slant in mind. So I'm going to read this as something having to do with Kathy's emotional satisfaction. Now, going with that, then the first thing that jumped out at me with this, other than the emotional satisfaction piece, is that the inset, because I do read the playing cards, the inset on the moon card is the Eight of Hearts. And so the Eight of Hearts can represent a change of heart. So here we have the perfect card in this situation, because the situation is that Kathy's husband Dave had a change of heart about being in a relationship with her and choosing to leave it. So that perfectly fits the situation and has led Kathy to want to explore the situation in the cards. So that's the moon and the Eight of Hearts in the moon. Then moving to the next card is mountain. So for me, the mountain represents a challenge, it represents a setback, it represents an obstacle. So here we have another natural card going with the situation in the context that it is that Kathy is now being presented with a challenge to her emotional satisfaction if we go back to the moon. And going with that now, in addition, the mountain is in the house of the clover. And so the clover is the space of luck and fortune. And so it just represents that there is a block or a challenge or an obstacle to Kathy's sense of luck and fortune. So we have that in addition. So now we could look at the first two cards as a pair. So we compare moon and mountain, and we could say that the cards are saying that there's a recognition of a challenge. It could be emotional satisfaction is challenged or becomes blocked. So again, it's just another way of reinforcing what the situation is on the table. So now we can move on to the next card, which is the sun. And this is interesting because the sun is a card of happiness, great happiness. It's a card of success and confidence, but it is also a card for me that represents something being clarified, shedding light on something, and something being illuminated. If you go with the idea that the sun is the best card in the deck and it outshines every other card on the table. And so now that I said that, even though the mountain, which is the card that comes before it, is a challenging card, the sun being so positive can sometimes minimize the effects of a negative card. And so we can look at the mountain as a negative card. But even with that, it's not eliminating the effect of the mountain. It's just kind of saying it's not maybe as severe as it would be if the sun card wasn't there. So going with that, now the sun is in the house of the ship, and so the ship for me represents movement, and it represents something going away, and it represents a journey. So here this is interesting because we could look at that as that this is going to be an important part of Kathy's life journey if we go with the idea that the ship is journey through life. So this is going to be something big in her overall life journey. It could also represent, since the ship is something that represents moving away or something that, you know, is going the distance, it could suggest that either her happiness, her confidence, or both, there's a process of movement with that, like they're going away. And that would make sense if you go with the idea, like if you're in a long-term relationship, or in this case a marriage, and then your spouse comes to you and says that for him or her, they need to move on, then that would, I think, play with or hit your sense of confidence in yourself, in your, you know, ability to be a partner or a spouse to someone else in a relationship. You know, that could, you know, take a hit. So that would make sense for me as well. So now we have another pair with mountain and sun, and we could say that that's a challenge to happiness, a challenge to confidence, or that a challenge is being illuminated. So I'm seeing that as a possibility. And then what we could do is we could read the line overall, and I tend to read the line from left to right. So I would see it as a change of heart, because I'm going to go more with the inset than the card itself. So a change of heart becomes a challenge, going with the mountain, to happiness. And so that again is another way of reinforcing or restating the situation as Kathy is experiencing it. So another thing that I tend to do with cards, you know, whether it's a 3 card or a 5 card, which I'm typically known for doing in other videos, I tend to look at the middle card as the hinge card or the focus card. So if we tend to look at the focus card here, mountain as the challenge, then an interesting thing happens. Because on one side we have the moon, and on the other side we have the sun, and they're polar opposites. So for me, one of the challenges that's being presented to Kathy is that it could be like one person in the relationship is like night, and the other person in the relationship is like day. you know, like polar opposites, night and day. And then the interesting thing about it here is that then the moon card, being a card of reputation, would make sense because people are known for being a certain way. They have a reputation. So it could be like one person has a reputation for, you know, being like this side, the nighttime side, and then the other person has a reputation for being, you know, like the sun. So it could be like one person in the relationship could be somewhat dreamy, you know, that kind of idea. If you go with the idea here that the moon is a card that can represent like a dreamlike quality, then the sun card could be somebody who is maybe has a sunny disposition, is very cheerful, very positive, you know, that kind of energy. But no matter what the situation is, I'm thinking that the challenge here is that both parties in the relationship are like opposites, you know, and so the challenge would be how can you work with, if we go with the idea here now that moon is work, so how can you work with the idea here that people are different? You know, it could be about a compatibility issue and working with the sense of people being who they are and honoring their difference. So that could be just something that could just be a way of adding additional advice for Kathy to consider. So the other thing here is if we go with the playing cards again, we have on one side of the challenge, we have the Eight of Hearts. So now I said this is about a change of heart. Another thing with the Eight of Hearts is that it could be a moving on card. So here again, we have somebody who feels the need to move on. And then over on the Sun, we have the Ace of Diamonds. And so for me, that represents like being engaged. So the other side of that is that somebody wants to remain engaged. And so another aspect of the Ace of Diamonds, it can actually symbolize an engagement ring. So here we have somebody who wants to move on, and then somebody who wants to stay committed and stay engaged. And so how can you work through that challenge? So that's just another thing that popped out at me in the moment. And so one of the other techniques, again, that I like to do with the playing cards is that I like to take them and add them up. So here we have 2 8s and an ace. So 8 and 8 is 16, and then 1 is 17. And so 17 is the 17th card in the deck, and so for me that is this stork. So I'm going to pull the stork from another place in the tableau so we can look at it. And I'm going to put it right here over the mountain. And so the stork is a card of change and movement and migration, because that's what storks do. Storks migrate and they move on. So it's very interesting. Again, it's another way of reinforcing that a change has taken place. Usually the stork is a card of positive change and something being improved, but I'm going to go with the fact that it just can represent change. So something has changed, and with that, the sense that one of the parties in the relationship has chosen to move on. And if you look, the stork is actually facing the moon, so that kind of just reinforces that idea if you go with the directional cue of the stork. And so the other thing about the stork, if we go with the visual here, then it could be saying too that the change now has Kathy feeling like maybe, because it's the Queen of Hearts, so it could be a woman, and her emotional state, her feeling state, could be that she feels like she has one leg to stand on because the stork has one leg raised. You know, now that's not typically a Lenormand way of looking at that, but that is just something that jumped out at me as I laid the card down on the table. So that's another way we can get some insight into the general advice being offered to Kathy. The last thing we can do is, my other technique would be to take the cards in question here and add them all up. So here we have 32 for the moon, we have 21 for the mountain, and 31 for the sun. And the total is 84. So what I do with a number over 36 like this is I take the 8 and the 4, add them together, and we have 12. So the 12th card in the deck is the birds, and so I'm going to once again pull that card so we can look at that. And the birds, if you recall from my previous video, I said the birds can be a card of partnership because there are two birds on the card. So here again, we have another way of looking at specifically the relationship or partnership aspect of Kathy's situation. Now, birds is also a card of communication and conversation. And so again, that would highlight the jumping off point being the conversation between Kathy and Dave about Dave's feeling like he needed to move on because he needed to have his sense of independence and he needed his space. So, and if you look at the visual here, we have one bird flying out of the nest. So it could be like, the idea of leaving the nest. But again, that particular portion that I just threw in there is not a Lenormand technique, but it just is another way of adding another way of reinforcing the situation. So the other thing about the birds, if we look at it from an emotional standpoint, going with the moon being the jumping off card and about Kathy's emotional satisfaction, then the birds is a card of frustration, anxiety, and sorrow. So here we have, again, now as a result of getting this change of heart, Kathy is now feeling a sense of frustration with Dave about their relationship, and maybe frustrated with the idea that he didn't communicate his sense of dissatisfaction in the relationship with her prior to just giving her the news that he was going to be moving on. And there's also a sense of anxiety about the future, because now the other part of her question was, what does she need to know about moving on, or what can she do to move on? So there is that, and that would be natural. There's a natural sense of anxiety about the idea of having to start over, start again, moving into a new space, a new beginning. That's totally natural. And then here, the other part of this would be a sense of sorrow for, all of a sudden being faced with this sense of loss about the relationship. She had the idea that she was in a space where she was in a good relationship. She was happy. Apparently she was emotionally satisfied, but her partner was not. So there is a sense of sorrow having to, mourn the loss of that, or as it changes, having to deal with that. So that is the way that I read the general advice for Kathy. So that brings this video to a close. So I hope you are finding these videos helpful, informative, enlightening with your own working with the cards, especially if you are looking at the cards from a love and relationship or romance standpoint. So now, as I sign off, in our next video, we're going to be looking at the four corners, and so I call that reading the corners, so that's what we'll do in the next video. So until then, I hope you're having a great day, and I will talk to you in our next video, and until then, take care.